Hello. This week we will go over lesson 5 by Hill and others, and we'll also look at Barnwell's chapter 8. So we're going to combine the two books and see what they both have to say about a similar topic. So Hill's 5th lesson is called How We Select Context. How we select context. So we're going to read the story on page 39 of her book called Brigitta's Done It Again. Brigitta's Done It Again. Peter's uncle lived in a village near the capital city. He heard that Peter was in the city, and so he sent a letter to him with one of the minibus drivers. As Peter read it, he made exclamations of shock and concern, and finally he shook his head and sighed. John didn't know Peter's family and wondered what in the world Peter's uncle had written to him to get such a response. That evening, he asked Peter about the letter. Peter smiled to himself and said, "I'll read it to you." This was what the letter said after the opening greetings. "I need to tell you what has happened to Brigitta. You know all about the fuss there was about her 2 years ago. Well, she's done it again. It seems quite incredible that she did not learn her lesson the first time. This time, however, Eric has taken a different line with her. He's washed his hands of the whole affair and has left her to sort it out. As a result, she's decided to visit old Veronica, and you know where she lives. I cannot imagine what will happen when she finally gets there, or even if she will ever get there." So now let's go to the group discussion and talk about these questions. Discuss what questions John might have after hearing this letter. So what questions might John have in reading this letter? And then discuss why you think John has these questions. So pause the video and discuss that. Okay, so there's a lot in that letter that needs some context, right? To understand what Peter's uncle is talking about, what happened before, what the context is, to be able to understand it. So John likely has a lot of questions. So how do we select context? Hill gives a funny example about saying, "The door is open." And is this person referring to the door of their home or the door of a lion's cage at the zoo? The context is essential. It's very important in order to understand what the speaker means. Hill says, text plus context leads to the intended meaning. So how do we know the intended context? Hill helps us understand that we already have much of the intended context, simply from 1, the information that immediately comes to mind, 2, the shared information we have with the speaker, and 3, the information that leads to cognitive benefits. So when Peter reads his uncle's letter, he has information that immediately comes to mind and the shared information he has with his uncle. But when John hears the letter, he doesn't have that shared information. Remember, cognitive benefits, or the things that benefit our mind, refers to the information that causes us to feel that what is being said is relevant, that it is important information, and that it connects in a meaningful way. And so we can think that letter was written to Peter, not to John. If it had been written to John, John would be very confused. But because of the shared information that Peter has with his uncle, that letter is relevant. So we know that scripture is meant to connect with audiences of all times in history and with all languages and cultures. So scripture is relevant to all people in all times and languages. We can assume that both direct and indirect communication in scripture is relevant to us, both what is stated out loud, written, and what is stated in English, we say between the lines, the indirect information. Both of them are relevant to us and are important parts of communication. The question you must ask in translating then is how? How does this passage connect with us today? Because it's meant to connect with us, so we need to understand how as translators. In the story, the conversation to Peter was direct. It was primary. The communication to John was indirect. It was secondary. In primary communication, you can have some mismatches with the assumed and shared context, but the message is typically understood well. So Peter understood the direct communication from his uncle pretty well. In secondary communication, as with John, the mismatches can be greater. So John has less assumed and shared context with Peter's uncle. So while God intended scripture for us all, Hill says we are the secondary audience. We need to carefully identify and try to understand the intended context and be careful with contextual mismatches. Our assumptions and our biases can lead us into creating context that was not intended. For example, the structures of our homes and our family structures, so my home, your home, family structures can look very different from those of the biblical times. Our baptism practices may be more specific than those described in the Bible. Our honorific terms, the way that we honor one another, or those words used to honor someone, may sound very different. So you have to be really careful when you're translating. So we're going to go now to Barnwell chapter 8, communicating across cultures and across time. So her chapter addresses this very topic, and she writes on page 54, she writes, "The audience of the translation can only understand the original author's message if they have access to both the explicit information that the author stated in words and the implicit information that the author assumed the audience would know. The explicit information that's stated or the implicit information that is assumed." So the Bible was written during what is believed to be thousands of years. And the last book, Revelation, was written almost 2,000 years ago from today. So we have to be careful to remember context changes a lot over that period of time. And we must look at each book in its own context and time in history. So Barnwell addresses balancing the two goals. If you haven't struggled with these two goals, you will. The goals are 1, faithfulness to the historical situation, and 2, communication effectiveness. So you must not change the message or the historical situation or the cultural background. The Israelites' history and background must be communicated clearly. And yet, you must listen to your own language and culture to help communicate the original message as accurately as possible. So now, this is a difficult task to balance these two goals. And if you are a translator, you know that you've already been working hard at doing this, preserving the historical context while also communicating effectively. Now I want you to translate the following statement. I'll put it in the WhatsApp group and briefly discuss as a group what you understand from the lesson. So translate this into Swahili and into your own language. Translators need to be alert for contextual mismatches that prevent their audiences from understanding Scripture. Translators need to be alert for contextual mismatches that prevent their audience from understanding Scripture. So translate that now. Okay, now for your assignment, please write out, number 1, the difference between direct and indirect communication information, the difference between direct and indirect information, and number 2, the difference between implicit and explicit information. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap, but I want you to understand the difference between direct and indirect information and the difference between implicit and explicit information. So there's a bit of a difference there between the two. And so I want you to try to explain that to me in the chat. So that's the end of the lesson. Thank you.